Welcome to the deep dive. So, you've given us quite a collection of sources here, news reports, deep analysis, some historical background, all centered on this really intense and frankly escalating conflict between Iran and Israel.
That's right. It's a lot to get through.
It is. And our goal today is really to, cut through some of the noise. We want to pull out the key insights from all this material and give you a clearer sense of this very complex situation.
Absolutely. Because it's definitely not simple.
No, exactly. As these sources make clear, we're not just talking military tit for tat. It involves cyber warfare, economic pressures, those regional proxy dynamics, even what's happening inside Iran itself. It's multi-layered.
It really is. And the material you've gathered gives us, I think, a pretty insightful look at how we actually got to this point, and maybe some hints about where things could be headed.
Okay, great. Let's dive in then. One of the things that jumped out immediately, looking at the historical context in these sources, is just how dramatically the relationship between Iran and Israel has changed. We tend to think of them as, born enemies, but that's not the whole story, is it?
Not at all, no. The sources really highlight that before 1979, before the Iranian Revolution, it wasn't this kind of baked-in hostility. In fact, under the Shah, there were actually unofficial connections, even some quiet cooperation.
Really? Cooperation?
Yes, reportedly Iran was the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel. Back then, the focus, according to what we've read, was much more about practical things: security alliances, trade, national interests. The Shah, it seems, didn't let the Palestinian issue get in the way of dealing with Israel when it suited Iran's needs.
So the 1979 revolution was the absolute turning point then. What specifically changed?
Fundamentally everything. The revolution ushered in a completely different worldview for Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini, the new regime, they championed this idea of resisting arrogant global powers, as they call them, and their allies in the region.
And Israel was seen as a prime example of that.
Exactly. Israel was quickly redefined. Terms like illegal state, cancerous entity, things that needed to be destroyed. The new Islamic Republic cut ties completely and started actively backing Palestinian liberation movements. That ideological shift, that's really the foundation for the archenemy status we see described today.
Right, and that deep-seated animosity has clearly moved into a much more active, kinetic phase lately. The sources lay out a timeline that shows a really significant escalation starting around 2024.
Yes, it's been a rapid and honestly pretty concerning acceleration. And it's clearly tied into the wider instability in the Middle East, including the Gaza war, which some sources point out really tightened the links between these different conflicts.
Okay, let's walk through some of those key moments the sources highlight. April 2024 seems pivotal.
It was. The sources mention Hezbollah kicking things off with attacks on northern Israel, something like 40 rockets. Israel then hit back, bombing a Hezbollah weapons facility in Lebanon.
And then came that major direct attack from Iran itself, April 13th and 14th. What did the sources say about the scale of that?
That was the big one. Unprecedented, really. Iran, but also its proxies, the Houthis from Yemen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, the Badr organization, even groups like the True Promise Corps, they launched this massive barrage. We're talking around 300 drones and ballistic missiles aimed at Israel.
Wow. And the sources also talk about a pretty significant international response to intercept those.
Yeah, that was crucial. A major joint effort. The US, the UK, Jordan too, they played a really big part, intercepting well over 100 of those Iranian drones. Apparently even Syria shot down some Israeli interceptors during the chaos.
But despite that huge number of projectiles, the damage reported was, well, surprisingly limited.
Fortunately, yes. Minor damage at Nevada Air Base, but it stayed operational. The main injuries reported were, tragically, a young child hit by shrapnel, and then about 31 others with minor issues, mostly anxiety or injuries from rushing to shelters. It really speaks to the effectiveness of Israel's defenses, I suppose.
And behind the scenes, diplomatically, things were frantic.
Oh, absolutely intense. The U.S. was reportedly pushing hard to prevent the attack in the first place, sending clear messages to Tehran that escalating wasn't smart and that, the U.S. would defend Israel. The sources even mentioned Russia's President Putin reaching out to Ayatollah Khamenei, urging restraint, specifically telling him not to target Israeli civilians. And militarily, the U.S. moved assets, more fighter jets, thousands of Marines, a whole flotilla of ships, including carrier strike groups. A real show of force.
Okay, moving the timeline forward. September 2024 saw another major event.
Yes, a big one. An Israeli strike in Beirut killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and also deputy commander in Iran's IRGC.
Just remind us, the IRGC is...
Right, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's Iran's powerful military branch. handles internal security, but also its external operations, including the Quds Force, which is their elite unit for missions abroad. Losing Nasrallah and a senior IRGC figure in one hit was a huge blow to Iran's regional network.
Which then leads us to October 2024, and Israel starting to strike inside Iran.
That's right. Sources point to strikes around October 25th, explosions heard in Tehran, Karaj, major cities. The Israeli military was quoted saying these were precision strikes on military targets following political directives, and there were also reports of more strikes in Syria near Damascus and Homs, hitting Iran-linked targets there, kind of continuing that pattern.
How did Iran react to being hit directly on its own soil?
Well, the rhetoric was extremely harsh. By the end of October, Supreme Leader Khamenei reportedly ordered preparations for a military response. Officials were quoted warning it would be harsh, even unimaginable.
And things got tense with Iraq around this time too, didn't they?
Yes, this really shows the complex web. Israeli intelligence, according to the sources, suggested Iran might be planning to launch attacks from Iraq. Then you had reports of Israel warning Baghdad it might hit Iran-backed militias on Iraqi soil, and counter-reports of Iran trying to move missiles into Iraq.
How did Iraq respond to being caught in the middle?
Pretty strongly, based on the sources. They warned about serious security threats from Israel, said they'd respond firmly to any aggression, and apparently saw Israel's communication with the UN as just a pretext to attack Iraq. Very tense.
Okay, then we fast forward to June 2025. Specifically June 13th. The sources describe this as a massive escalation.
Yeah, this is depicted as unprecedented. Widespread Israeli attacks across Iran, causing what the sources call huge damage, especially to Iran's military and even political elite.
The targets mentioned are really quite something.
They are. The sources list attacks on critical infrastructure, including nuclear sites, Natanz is mentioned specifically, and facilities involved in making nuclear materials and ballistic missiles. Things they'd apparently hit before, but this sounds like a major escalation.
And the leadership decapitation seems, well, extensive.
Devastating, according to the reports. They mention the killing of Iran's armed forces, chief of staff, the head of the IRGC, the commanders of the IRGC's Air Force, and the Quds Force, even a close aide to the supreme leader. Some reportedly killed in their sleep, plus other commanders and nuclear scientists. Just a massive blow to the hierarchy.
And striking the Jahan Kudak Tower in Tehran. That feels symbolic.
It does. That detail really sticks out in the sources. It suggests the attacks weren't just military, but also hitting high-profile, symbolic targets right in the capital.
So after that level of attack, how did Iran respond?
They did retaliate. Missile barrages launched on June 13th, but the sources describe them as largely ineffective. Apparently, Israeli defenses intercepted almost all of them. Tragically, though, 3 Israeli civilian deaths were reported from those counterstrikes.
Okay, so that brings us up to speed on the escalation. Let's talk about the military balance. How do the sources portray the capabilities of Iran and Israel at this point?
They paint a picture of, well, quite different situations. Iran has this huge standing army and it relies a lot on proxies and covert stuff, but its position is described as maybe its most vulnerable in decades.
Vulnerable how?
Key proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah have been hit hard, severely disabled according to some accounts. Supply routes, especially through Syria after the Assad regime fell, are disrupted. And its own air defenses took a significant hit from those Israeli strikes. One source even mentioned a feeling of, frankly, humiliation in Tehran about how deeply Israel could penetrate, apparently even smuggling drones into Iran for attack.
Wow, whereas Israel is presented very differently.
Yes, as having a much more conventional, technologically advanced military. Formidable forces on land, sea, and air, lots of the latest US and European tech, plus a strong defense industry of their own. The sources suggest Israel has the capacity to fight on multiple fronts if it has to.
And that layered missile defense system seems absolutely critical.
It's crucial, yes. Developed over many years, a lot of US help. It's designed to intercept all sorts of things heading for cities or important sites. Now, no defense is totally foolproof, right? But the sources definitely credit it with preventing catastrophic damage and casualties, especially during those big Iranian barrages in April and June 2025.
But the proxy strategy is still central for Iran, even if those groups are weakened.
It seems so. Iran uses groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, various militias in Iraq to exert influence, to keep Israel and its allies off balance. But as we said, they're weakened. One source even questioned if Hezbollah, given its own problems, would really jump in fully this time to back Iran militarily. The Houthis are still active, though attacking ships in the Red Sea, firing towards Eilat in southern Israel. And Israel keeps hitting Iran-linked targets in Syria. That sort of whack-a-mole pattern, as one source put it.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Beyond the physical battlefield, the sources really stress the cyber dimension of this conflict.
Yes, that's a critical front, absolutely. The sources make it clear Iran is very active in cyberspace. They're targeting the U.S. government, military, political figures, but also, importantly, critical infrastructure, private companies, individuals, utilities.
Are there specific examples mentioned?
There are. They recall things like the 2023 intrusions by a group calling itself Cyber Avtringers. They hit U.S. water systems, apparently often just exploiting really basic security flaws like default passwords.
Seriously, default passwords.
Yeah. And another IRGC-linked group was flagged for using custom malware, stuff designed to actually take control of water and fuel systems in the U.S. and Israel.
But the sources also kind of hedge on Iran's cyber power, suggesting limitations.
Well, historically, yes. Their technical sophistication, their actual success rate, has often been described as limited. And they do tend to, let's say, exaggerate the impact of their hacks. Often it's more about the psychological effect, sowing fear, rather than causing massive practical damage.
But the capability is there for something worse.
Oh, definitely. The sources are clear on that. They can launch destructive attacks, like using wipers malware designed just to race data and completely cripple systems.
So if Iran feels its conventional military options are limited after these strikes, does cyber become a more likely avenue for retaliation?
That's exactly what the sources suggest, yes. If their ability to strike back physically is degraded, hitting back in cyberspace becomes a much more attractive or perhaps necessary option for them. The expectation described is that they'd activate more operatives, targeting, quote, anything and everything they can in Israel and the U.S.
How do the two sides compare in terms of cyber defense resilience?
Israel is described as historically quite resilient. They've dealt with Iranian cyber attacks for a long time. The U.S., though, is highlighted as having, well, quite a few vulnerabilities, especially in smaller utilities, critical infrastructure operators who might not have sophisticated defenses. So the message from the sources is U.S. companies, particularly in those sectors, really need to be on high alert.
Okay, let's turn to the economy. The sources talk about immediate market reactions to the Israeli strikes inside Iran.
They do. Oil prices jumped significantly. One source mentioned a 7% surge right after those strikes were reported.
And why is that oil price spike such a big deal globally?
Because it ripples out everywhere, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Higher energy costs mean higher prices for, well, almost everything. Transport, making goods, food production, heating. It all gets more expensive. It directly fuels inflation globally.
Right.
Which then makes it harder for central banks everywhere to think about cutting interest rates to help economies grow. One estimate mentioned was a $10 rise in oil could add something like 7 pence to a liter of petrol in the UK, just as an example.
And there's also the fear of physical disruptions to supply.
That's a huge risk, the sources flag. The possibility of Iran trying to close the Strait of Hormuz, that's a massive worry. About 20% of the world's oil goes through there. Any blockage would send shipping and insurance costs skyrocketing. Plus, the Houthis potentially stepping up attacks in the Red Sea adds another layer of risk to global trade routes.
These economic effects aren't felt equally everywhere, though.
No, definitely not. Higher oil prices, for instance, actually benefit Russia, helps fund their war in Ukraine. India, mentioned in the sources, is watching nervously. They expect short-term bumps, but seem confident their economy can cope unless things really spiral out of control. And you also saw things like gold futures rising as investors look for safer assets amidst the uncertainty.
Okay, so we've got the military, cyber, economic angles. What about the international and regional reactions? How are other countries responding, according to the sources?
The U.S. role is obviously central, based on the material. Washington's position is described as kind of supporting Israel's right to defend itself, but also trying really hard to stop things escalating into a wider regional war. And always keeping that primary goal in mind, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
There were some quotes mentioned.
Yes, from former President Trump, things like telling Iran to make a deal before there is nothing left, and talk of the 60-day ultimatum. On a practical level, the U.S. warned Iran not to target American forces, started voluntary evacuations for military families in the region, and reportedly pulled some diplomats from Iraq as a precaution.
What about other global powers?
Russia's call for restraint back in April is noted. And Central Asian countries, the sources say, are trying to stay neutral, pushing for de-escalation. They're worried about potential spillover effects like migration, energy price hikes, and apparently they're beefing up their own border security.
And within the region itself, concerns about it spreading.
Big concerns, yes. Especially the Gulf nations could get dragged in, maybe if Iran targets easier options there. Qatar's diplomatic efforts were highlighted. They're a luffa. Emir apparently spoke with President Trump about de-escalation. Generally, the Gulf states have made it clear they don't want a regional war. And the weakening of Iran's proxies, like Hezbollah, creates new dynamics too. Challenges for those groups, maybe strengthen state actors in the long run, but you can bet Hezbollah will still try to make political gains inside Lebanon from the situation.
Right. Okay, finally, let's look inside Iran. How is all this affecting things domestically? What do the sources say about internal dynamics?
They paint a picture of, well, a population left pretty shaken and angry after the major Israeli strikes. And interestingly, a lot of that anger seems directed inwards.
At their own leadership.
Yes, apparently towards the leaders for, one, failing to protect civilians and key figures, but also for pursuing policies that led Iran into this isolated and vulnerable position in the first place.
So it's amplifying pre-existing tensions.
Exactly. There were already significant domestic strains, simmering discontent. And while many Iranians might desire regime change, the sources strongly suggest they absolutely do not want it to come through war and widespread bloodshed.
That must put the regime in a really tough spot.
A major dilemma, according to the analysis. They're kind of caught, aren't they? Either they retaliate forcefully, which risks even more escalation, potentially more domestic unrest if things go wrong, or they're seen as weak, as failing to stand up to Israel, which completely undermines their core resistance ideology, the narrative that holds sway with their hardline supporters. Both paths are incredibly risky for the regime's stability, its survival even.
And there are signs they're worried about that internal reaction.
Yes, the reports of authorities restricting internet access, threatening people on social media, that suggests a preemptive effort to clamp down, control the narrative, and head off any potential dissent before it can gain traction.
So looking ahead now, the future, what do the sources suggest might happen next? It sounds like uncertainty is the main theme.
Uncertainty is definitely the word you see repeated across the material. Predicting the exact next steps is incredibly difficult. But the overall picture painted is of a region firmly on an escalatory trajectory.
One analysis you mentioned, Clinton laid out some scenarios.
They did. They talked about a range of possibilities. Everything from sort of continued low-level conflict, just muddling through, but always under the shadow of bigger escalation.
Right.
All the way through shifting red lines, maybe more limited war, or even tipping over into a full-scale conflict. And they stressed how small events, tipping points, could quickly shift the dynamic from one scenario to another.
Is there any talk of this crisis potentially pushing things back towards diplomacy? Or is it more likely to lead to even more drastic actions?
That tension is definitely there in the analysis. Could this shock lead back to nuclear talks? Some sources mention that possibility, but also note that talks with the U.S. were already stalled, and then Iran suspended them after the June strikes.
So the alternative?
The alternative discussed is this idea of pushing harder, targeting leadership more, hitting the economy harder, essentially trying to facilitate regime change from the outside. But that's framed as a massive gamble. Highly unpredictable consequences, potentially creating a power vacuum like we saw in, say, Iraq or Libya. Really dangerous territory.
It feels like Iran is weakened, but maybe also feels cornered, needing to react somehow?
That's one perspective, yes. That even if Iran is pressured into a temporary step back, the sheer scale of the Israeli strikes puts enormous pressure on the regime to hit back eventually, just to save face, to maintain its image and deterrence, especially in the eyes of its remaining proxies. It's also framed as this bigger power struggle, right? Israel aiming to cement its role as the dominant regional player, Iran fighting for recognition and trying to isolate Israel.
And the ability of outside powers to actually control this seems limited.
The sources seem quite skeptical about that. While international pressure for de-escalation is needed, the real ability of external actors to steer events seems limited right now, especially without really firm, united political will from Washington and its key allies.
It was interesting, one source drew a parallel to a completely different situation.
Yes, suggesting the Iran-Israel conflict, particularly the nuclear aspect, holds lessons for dealing with North Korea. It highlights the dangers of nuclear proliferation, obviously, but also maybe the potential, however slim, for solutions through dialogue, referencing the original Iran nuclear deal. And it really underscores how vital international cooperation is when you're dealing with these kinds of existential threats.
Okay, that gives us a really thorough sweep through the material you provided. We've covered that huge historical shift, tracked the really rapid escalation through 2024 and 2025, looked at the military angle, the cyber front, the economic impacts, how the region and the world are reacting, and those crucial internal pressures building inside Iran. It's incredibly interconnected, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so volatile. And as the sources just keep emphasizing, what happens next is genuinely uncertain.
Right. So thinking about all of that, everything we've just pulled from these sources, the direct military clashes, the hidden cyber war, the economic shockwaves, the proxy fighting, the stress inside Iran's leadership. If you had to pick one element based purely on the material we've looked at, what feels like the most unpredictable wild card in all of this, which layer, with all these fronts tangled together, do you think holds the most potential for unforeseen twists that could really change the whole direction of this conflict going forward?